Who was your most impactful patient? He was a sweet resident at a memory care facility. He was quiet, not very talkative. He didn't seem to want much, but he did need a lot of care. Because he was so labor-intensive, no one wanted to care for him and often ignored him. I was new to the facility. I spotted this resident and decided to look after him myself. I actually got the resident cleaned up and sorted out and returned him to the TB room when one of the caregivers started yelling at me for providing care. I later learned that the other caregivers had teamed up to pretend that the resident was difficult and should be sent away because they hated having to deal with his family. I told them off and continued doing my job. Pretty soon, I was almost the only person doing any kind of work. Everyone else was on their phones. Irritated, I was about to take my lunch and then I passed by the dining room. This resident had been shoved into the dining room and left there, in the dark. He was so tired, he was almost falling out of his wheelchair. I immediately went into the locked, dark dining room and brought him out. And he needed to be cleaned up and put to bed. I found his nurse and caregiver and told them he needed care. They blew me off and told me to just leave him and let the next shift deal with it. I was livid, and when I saw one of the nursing staff yell at him, I immediately intervened and took care of him myself. I believe it took me about an hour and a half. I got him into the restroom and began cleaning him up. He gave no resistance, but needed assistance, which I so gladly gave. I was angry about having to be stuck cleaning him up, but not as angry as I was about knowing he'd been sitting in this mess in the dark and locked dining room for 5 hours. Well, I got him cleaned up and walked him to the bed. I grabbed a pair of gloves, a clean pair of socks, and cleaned his feet. I used some lotion to give him a foot rub and then put socks on him. Afterward, I told him good night and that I would be back to check on him before I left. I went to draw the blanket over him and he caught my hand. I turned toward him, thinking maybe I missed something. He squeezed my hand and just said 2 words. "Thank you." I was shocked. I'd been working there for over 3 months and wasn't even aware this resident could talk. I said, "You're welcome," and left the room. I did go back and check on him before I left. The very next day, I went to work early to attend a staff meeting. The resident spotted me and started coming toward me. I gave the matter no thought and just took him with me. He quietly sat next to me during the meeting and followed me out after it was over. I took him into the dining room and fed him. He asked for some coffee and I got it for him. He told me he didn't like the dessert, so I went to get him ice cream instead. After dinner, I took him to the restroom and then the TV room. His son came to visit and I pointed him out and went about my business with my other charges. It turned out that the resident needed to be toileted, but he was being resistant toward the other nursing staff. His son came looking for me and so I just said to walk him to the restroom and he will tell you what he wants to do. His son said, "Shannon, my dad can't talk nor walk." I said, "Yeah, he can." His son insisted that his dad couldn't walk or talk and hadn't done so in months. I just said, "Okay, this is news to me," and I went to where the resident was sitting. I just walked up to him and extended my hand. He reached for it. He stood up and told me he needed to go to the restroom, right in front of his son, and off we went. His son was in total shock. I took care of him and walked him back out to his visitor. His son had called his mother, the resident's wife, and she was there in a flash. She saw him walking with me and he went over to her and we all went to sit in the dining room. Then the resident says to his son, "You want some coffee, son? It's very good," prompting his wife to hug him and cry. I just left them to visit. Afterward, his son came to find me because they wanted the resident to be put to bed. My surprise? The resident, who I was told couldn't speak, specifically asked for me. So I came. It normally took several people and a couple of hours to get the resident ready for bed. When I walked into the TV room where they were now, the resident spotted me and rose from the recliner and walked toward me. I just walked him to his room, got him showered, shaved and all his care done, and then put him to bed. I said good night. He said thank you. I finished up my shift and went home. The very next day, I was off. I had a date that evening, but one of my coworkers texted me for help. I came straight to the facility, where the resident's wife and son were there. I walked straight in, saying nothing to anyone, took his hand and took him into his room and got him cleaned and into bed. Took me all of 20 minutes, and I was in heels I had to remove to get it done. When I walked out, the resident's son came to me and said they were having a hard time getting his dad to go to bed. I replied that I'd already taken care of it, and then I left to continue my evening. My supervisor called me into a meeting. Turned out that apparently I had some positive effect on the resident. He was walking around and talking more and the family wanted me to be his regular caregiver. I agreed. As time went on, we bonded strongly with each other, but then a time came when he ended up going home. It turned out that he was at a point where his family could care for him. This was at a time when I was about to quit my job because I didn't feel like what I did really made a difference. It was this resident who taught me that while what I did didn't mean much to the world, it meant the world to him. It restored my passion.